para poderme bañar. Ahora ya no me preocupo, no salgo en mi casa, el agua llega acá.
Cerquita.
Siempre tengo mi servicio del agua, me gusta estar al día.
Al día, al día.
Ya no me preocupo por agua, siempre estoy al día.
Al día, al
Agüita
día.
por aquí, agüita por allá, agüita por delante y agüita porque estoy al día.
Al día, al día.
Ya no me azoro y me relajo porque estoy al día.
Al día, al día.
Me prestan un buen servicio porque estoy al día.
Al día, al día.
Tengo más tiempo, ahorro energía y al día.
Al día, al día.
Pues la motobomba ya nos mantiene encendida.
Antes no me importaba la calidad con que el agua me llegaba. Luego me puse a pensar que algo tenía que mejorar, que la salud era la prioridad. Y en mi barrio ejemplo empecé a dar. Mi vecino me pedía agua,
Tu vecino te pedía agua,
hasta mi vecina me pedía agua.
hasta tu vecina te pedía agua.
Le conté a todos de la situación y toditos entramos en razón. Nunca en la vida prestaba atención, que nosotros mismos éramos la solución. Ahí mismito empezamos a cambiar y el servicio empezó a mejorar. Tuberías nuevas, el agua más seguida y toditos felices de la vida. Y es que
Antes pasábamos trabajo llenando huecos para podernos bañar.
la valla
Y ahora que está el acueducto no nos preocupamos, el agua llega acá.
cerquita.
Siempre tengo mi servicio del agua, me gusta estar al día.
Al día, al día.
Ya no me preocupo por agua, siempre estoy al día.
Al día, al
Agüita
día.
por aquí, agüita por allá, agüita por delante y agüita porque estoy al día.
Al día, al día.
Ya no me azoro y me relajo porque estoy al día.
Al día, al día.
Me prestan un buen servicio porque estoy al día.
Al día, al día.
Tengo más tiempo, ahorro energía y al día.
Al día, al día.
Pues la motobomba ya nos mantiene encendida.
Vecino, al día hay que estar. El agua no se cobra, le voy a explicar. Es un servicio que nos...
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for being here. So it's a pleasure for me to welcome you to this session that will focus on sharing experiences and best practices across transboundary river basins. So my name is Claudette Spiteri, and I'm project manager of the IW Learn. For those of you that don't know IW Learn, so IW Learn is the, let's say, the knowledge management platform for the JEF-funded international waters projects. And therefore, very much at the core is this enabling of sharing of experiences and best practices between, let's say, transboundary settings. Since 1992, JEF had supported no less than 60 transboundary river basins in aspects related to cooperation and to sustainable basin management. Well, if you'd like to know more about JEF and IW Learn, I invite you to visit our booth on the 5th floor. Now, in the next 1.5 hours, we will build on the highly informative exchanges we already had late last year in Vienna. Some of you in the room were also in Vienna for the International River Symposium. And there we had a session dedicated to the enablers and challenges when it comes to implementing river basin management plans, particularly in transboundary settings. Let's say we all know that cooperative management, especially when it comes to shared and transboundary basins, is crucial for sustainability and peace development. However, in reality, the reality shows that implementation of these plans is faced by a number of challenges. So be it technical, political, financial, engagement, commitment, integration or fragmentation, governance, enforcement, and so on and so forth. But the good news is that from the work, the extensive work, as well as the experience in different basins, we actually realize that many of these challenges are similar across the basins. And therefore, there's a lot we can learn through talking about them and sharing experiences, successes, or issues encountered. Well, with that, just a brief introduction. We will hear some short key lessons from 5 different basins and river basin organizations. So that's the Danube, the Mekong, Nile, the Orange Sanku, and Okavango. And this will be then followed by a panel discussions that is more aimed to share these experiences and challenges, as well as the benefits that come with cooperation. I stop here. I wish you all a pleasant, inspiring, engaging session. And I hand over to Suzanne for moderating the rest of the session. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Claudette, for the introduction from IW Learn. I'll be moderating the session today. My name is Susanne Schmeier. I'm an associate professor at IHE Delft, and I'm very happy that we're all coming together here, as Claudette said, as a follow-up to an exchange that we've been trying to organize with all the co-conveners, with GIZ, with IW Learn, with Jeff, with all the basin organizations, to really move a step forward and really look into what really are the challenges. There's so many efforts around the world when it comes to developing basin management plans, but why do they often not get implemented? Or if they get implemented, why do they not necessarily lead to the benefits that we've been expecting from them? And today we want to look at different, very specific challenges relating to biodiversity, relating to stakeholder engagement, but also to funding. How do we find the money to actually do all of that? And I'm very much looking forward to this exciting discussion. As Claudette said, 5 very, very brief, emphasis on very brief, introductory presentations, and we'll start with how can we actually link the national and the transboundary level when it comes to basin development. And we'll hear the experiences from Orasicom about that. Tate Lenka Tamai, the executive secretary of Orasicom, whom I'm not seeing. There. Lenka, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Prof. Do I press here?
You can press here.
Yeah. Just to share a few lessons from the Orange Team Group regarding the linking or linkage between the national programs and the river basin management processes. I just pulled together 3 slides or 4 in this regard to say, I cannot claim that this is because of the River Basin Organization Secretariat. But I think having within a River Basin Organization the most relevant officials when it comes to those elements, the element of water resource planning, the element of large-scale water use, and also financing, those are very important. What I've listed here really speaks to the government departments which are most relevant, which I feel that if you have in the River Basin Organization structures, they make the work a little bit easier. The second point which I thought I could elaborate on has to do with inclusion of issues related to demand projections. And here, although it's hiding somewhere within the narrative, the issue of water allocation. Countries, although this does not come very directly when we are listing the projects that we do in a river basin program or plan, countries are very interested in issues of water allocation. how much water is going to be available to their country in particular. But I feel that even the joint water resources field excursions around the various number of areas that I've listed there is also very important to ensure that the river basin plan and the river basin actions are relevant to the specific countries. Going not very far from the end is just really one of the areas which is very specific, where there was a deliberate move to not only address action planning at the river basin level, but also to address peculiarities for the individual states in the Orange Synchro, where in the case of Botswana, the issue related to groundwater desalination was very, very critical. In the case of Lesotho, catchment rehabilitation and pollution from manufacturing sector. And really here, Ndadepera knows, it was about the textile industry that we have at the time. Pollution from those was seen as a peculiar issue. In Namibia, it was around tackling invasive alien vegetation. A plant called prosopis was seen as a problem area, and in South Africa, it was around the degradation of the river mouth, which is also happens to be the river, a Ramsar site. And these were just really examples of how national processes were brought into the river basin scale. Thank you very much. I hope I didn't go beyond 5 minutes.
No, thanks, Tatelenka. As you see, we're doing very short snapshots to have time for your questions and discussion later. So if anything pops up, what you're hearing now, make a note and bring that back later. But very interesting to hear how in the Orange Basin, there is the attempt, successfully I would say, to really bring together what's at the very heart of local challenges and what's at the heart of basin planning, and make sure that those are mutually beneficial and support each other. Because what we're seeing in so many basins is that basin planning is happening at the high transboundary basin level, but not necessarily picks up the issues that are really issues on the ground. So I think important lesson to take with us and to maybe come back to later on in the panel discussion. We're moving a little bit north, still in Africa, but a little bit north. Happy that we have Michael Kizar with us from the Nile Basin Initiative. Michael, join us, and we're looking very much forward to hearing from you about another challenge that basin management faces, which is how do we bring in all these sectors, especially all these nasty sectors that use water but might not always want to cooperate with us. Michael.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to you all. I have more slides than the three, but I'm going to skip many of them. They're just there for completeness. So I'll skip and get to, these are useful, and get to this slide. These are the part of the Nile Basin Initiative 10-year strategy, the areas where we concentrate in terms of delivering products to our countries in water security, energy security, food security, environmental sustainability, climate change adaptation, and transboundary water governance. And this is how we are organized. Basically, when NBI was established, it was established under the stewardship of the ministries of water. But of course, we know that issues of water resources management and development go beyond the ministries of water. They get into agriculture, energy, and all other ministries. So, strictly speaking, our governance structure involves Ministry of Water, but it's expected that we also link into the other sector ministries that are responsible for different aspects of water. Now, how do we do that? Okay. The way we do it is in several different ways. One is that for all those goals that I've mentioned, we have projects. Each project will have a regional expert working group. The regional expert working group will be drawn from experts in the countries who are in that sector. If it is an agriculture, a food security issue, or energy, the experts will come from the countries to be part of this expert working group. And the reason we have these expert working groups is that they're the ones that steer the implementation of the projects and are able to bring in that national dimension into this regional work. But secondly, we've also set up, I'm not going so much into the structure, but at technical level, we have a technical advisory committee, which is again from the Ministry of Water. And under the technical advisory committee, whoever the member of the technical advisory committee from each of the countries, we've set up an NBI desk officer. The desk officer supports the technical advisory committee member in terms of coordinating national level engagements across the different sectors in terms of planning, annual activities, and then reporting. So we organize at least 3 meetings of these cross-sector setups under the desk officer, at least 3 per year, and then with the idea that this is, again, inputs into the regional work. So this is how we do it, at least at national level, but also making sure that experts that come from the different sectors are able to participate in the regional work. However, as we're doing this, we found that there's another problem that we have within, another challenge that we have within the Nile Basin. That Nile Basin Initiative was established by countries as an intergovernmental organization that has a mandate across the entire Nile Basin. But within the same region, countries have established other kinds of arrangements that deal with similar mandates, okay? Not for the entire basin, but deal with similar mandates. For example, within the East African community, there's the Lake Victoria Basin Commission that deals with Lake Victoria issues. But of course, Lake Victoria is part of the Nile Basin system. Governments also have established IGAD, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, and 50% of the scope, the regional scope of IGAD is actually located within the Nile Basin. So we find that there's also that issue that there are different players that are working within the same region on similar mandates, and sometimes duplication of effort can result, okay? So as NBI, we set out to perform a coordination role of the efforts of the of all the different players through the process of developing an actual Nile River Basin Management Plan, which brings together all the different players to develop a number of targets, some sort of Nile agenda, and this to which we all aspire to achieve. And then each of our plans and projects with each of the players' plans and projects can be aligned to one common agenda. And we spent like 2 years developing this together with the different players. And actually just last year, we had it approved by our Nile Council of Ministers for implementation. Implementation means that each of the players really takes it and uses it as a compass for their planning, their implementation and everything. And then we come together periodically to do a joint assessment of where we are in terms of addressing the challenges that we have in the basin. So this is a little bit more detail on that there's a Nile agenda, and we've developed actually about 14 strategic development targets aligned to the SDGs, and we've done this in a very collaborative way, and now each of us continues implementing as we move forward and assessing, doing these joint assessments to make sure that we are always aligned to the same agenda rather than competing and duplicating our efforts. Thank you very much. That brings me to the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Very interesting how the NBI is organizing this, and I think also interesting to see that it does require quite a bit of coordination mechanisms and therefore also people who actually do the work if we really want to bring together these different sectors, something that I think we tend to forget sometimes. I was also happy to see the environment mentioned in the slides, which takes us directly to the next presentation, down to Southern Africa again, to the Okavango, because another challenge is that many basin organizations and those managing basins are facing is how to bring in the ecosystems, how to account for biodiversity, how to bring that in and give that a prominent place in the basin management process. And we'll hear from the Okavango, one of the most beautiful, most biodiverse basins around the world, from Pera Ramueli, the Executive Secretary of Okacom. Pera, please.
Thank you very much, Suzanne, and thank you, colleagues, for being here to listen to a little bit of an expose on what is happening in that part of the world, in the COB, as we call it, the Kubango-Okavango River Basin, shared by 3 states, Angola in the north, Namibia in the west, and southeast is Botswana. And these countries are sharing this between themselves. And I think one should note, especially in terms of biodiversity and other things, environment, that the bulk of the water resources comes from the highlands in Angola and traverses the basin and ends in the delta, where it supports a highly rich biodiversity ecosystem with both flora and fauna that is found in abundance in that part of the world. Now, I think just to give a bit of a background, the basin supports, as I said, high levels of biodiversity and sustained globally important wetlands. One of these, and the most iconic, is the Okavango Delta, which is one of the largest Ramsar sites in the world, as I hope, in the world, but obviously there might be others. And it was declared, in addition to being a Ramsar site, a 1,000 World Heritage Site in 2014, further putting the level of importance in terms of biodiversity on this ecospace. It is also a notion that I've already mentioned, that most of the water resources originates in the highlands in Angola and are responsible for sustaining all life and ecosystems and biodiversity from the Angolan highlands all the way down to the delta, where it ends in a desert. It's a peculiar water course which does not empty into the sea but empties inland, with most of that water going either up or underground. Now, this, as an observed important issue that needs to be addressed as part of the other things in the basin states in 2008, culminating in 2011, they did undertake a transboundary diagnostic analysis study, which identified that the basin is really going to face some challenges if things are not handled properly. And in that context, they were able to identify 4 thematic areas of focus that should guide their activities. And one of these 4 thematic areas is environment and biodiversity, putting the level of importance on environment and biodiversity at the highest and core of the activities in the basin. Now, based on the TDA, they developed a strategic action program, which then is becoming a document that guides our activities and work in that basin to support the 3 member states. And these are supported, of course, by national action plans. That makes it possible for realism of things happening not just at the transboundary level, but linked very closely with what is happening at the basin level. Now, they were even able to actually agree on a shared vision, which is of an economically prosperous, socially just, and environmentally healthy development of the Kubango Basin. It's a very important vision that most of the things that we do have to be leading us to realizing this, the big goal of the basin. Now, some of the issues that were identified, then still linking to biodiversity, are the inherent changes that are happening when we were doing the TDA, which includes the changes in abundance and distribution of biota, the variation and reduction of hydrological flows, change in sediment dynamics, and change in water quality. This all driven by population increase, poverty and land use changes, and climate change, as we now have come to realize that climate change is an important element in the discussions and discourse in river basin management. Now, based on that, they identified 6 strategic areas of integrated management objectives. And these are what guides all activities that takes place within the basin. First, the shared vision, and then everything that we do being based on solid scientific analysis. Number 3 talks very directly to issues of biodiversity, wherein we actually look at in issues of environmental and socio-economic monitoring programs, including the issues related to biodiversity. And of course, integrated planning, livelihoods. Livelihoods is quite a strong component, where now we are looking at who benefits from this resource and what it is applied that we can make sure that they continue to benefit the communities that subsist in the basin. And without them having alternative livelihoods, it is becoming a problem that they could continue inadvertently degrading the system that ultimately needs to be preserved and conserved. I've just highlighted here as a last slide some of the issues or rather activities that we have been undertaking to try and address ourselves to this issue of biodiversity. We have really worked into a program of developing a comprehensive environmental diversity monitoring, which includes conducting joint surveys from the source to the sink of the basin from the highlands to the delta. And this is done jointly by the 3 states, scientists and their experts, to look at the imperatives that are subsisting within the basin, especially in terms of the flow, the quality, the biological quality of the basin. And then we're looking at those activities. Then there's a basin wetlands critical. These basins, wetlands are critical for everything that they have to provide as ecosystem services. And some of these require that we enforce a lot of work in terms of source water protection, because where this water originates, it's Miombo forest with bogs and sponges that needs to be protected, because if degraded, will not continue to give you the basic services that they do to provide community livelihoods, alternatives, and of course we have done and started doing issues relating to sediment. The delta depends very much on the sediment and the flux in terms of the flooding that takes place in there. And of course, these are some of the things that we really find important and could realize us being able to manage our biodiversity adequately. We have developed recently, for instance, a strategic environment assessment with associated transboundary EIA. This is to make sure that all the plans that these countries have and they implement are cognizant and conscious of the impacts that this might have environmentally. And of course, this is something that makes it important for us to be continuing to manage this basin in an environmental manner. And we are aware that although it's said to be still relatively underdeveloped with the ecosystem still quite intact, that is not going to remain in perpetuity, because development is required and we have to balance development with environmental protection. I thank you.
Thank you, Pera. I think the Okavango indeed is an emblematic basin when it comes to why we need to bring in biodiversity into basin management. For sure, not the only one, but definitely one that symbolizes it. But you also mentioned, Pera, the role of communities, the role of civil society, and that's what we'll hear about in the next presentation, where we're moving to Europe now, we're moving to the Danube, and we'll be hearing from Hélène Masliha-Gekarov, I knew I would stumble over it, we talked about it before the session, who will share the experiences from the ICPDR when it comes to engaging stakeholders. Hélène, please.
Yes, so I apologize already. I'm afraid I'm going to go beyond the 5-minute limit, but I'll try not to be removed physically from the podium by Susanne. So yes, welcome to the Danube River Basin and to my presentation on behalf of the ICPDR on how we do stakeholder engagement and public participation in the Danube River Basin. So just to sort of put us back on the map, it all started in June 1994, the signing of the Danube River Protection Convention in Sofia in Bulgaria. with our key principles. The convention serves as the cornerstone for the cooperative efforts of the countries of the Danube River Basin, outlining these objectives: sustainable and equitable use of water, protecting water and ecological resources, reducing nutrients and hazardous substances, and managing floods and ice hazards. So in 1998, the convention came into force, and that was, of course, a significant moment that solidified the legal foundation for cooperation for the Danube countries. And the years 2000 and 2007 were also very important milestones with the adoption of the EU Water Framework Directive, what we call here in this part of the world the WFD, and the EU Floods Directive, the FD. So these two directives were essentially providing a common language and framework for addressing water-related issues across the Danube River Basin, and they included public participation, stakeholder consultation in the process. And in June 2004, the ICPDR set up the Public Participation Expert Group, and also at the same time instituted Danube Day, which marked the anniversary, the 10-year anniversary of the adoption of the DRPC, the Danube River Protection Convention, and also the celebration of Danube Day, which is done every year on June 29th and is an extremely important and federative event across the Danube River Basin. It really serves as a great opportunity to engage the public and to raise awareness about the need for cooperation and collective action in protecting and preserving the Danube River. I would say in summary that the Danube cooperation thrives on pillars of trust, collective will and ownership, reinforced by an effective mechanism for cooperation and public participation called for by the Water Framework Directive and the Floods Directive. Public participation is a requirement of the two directives, so Article 14 of the WFD and Articles 9 and 10 of the Floods Directives require, in a nutshell, member states to encourage the active involvement of interested parties in the implementation of both directives. So before I describe the way we do it in the Danube, I just want to go back to the basics of public participation and stakeholder engagement. Public participation, a broad definition, is allowing people to influence the outcome of plans and working processes. It also means improving decision-making, which in our Danubian vernacular means creating awareness of environmental issues and helping to increase acceptance and commitment towards our two management plans, which are, of course, the end of itself for our 6-year cycles. And what one can do beyond the limits of the public participation exchange. And another thing that I will say in my next slide is, for sure, the public participation process is one that should be organized and adapted to various circumstances. So who participates? The directive is actually prescriptive in the sense that at least stakeholders, i.e. interested parties, should be involved when dealing with active involvement. So these stakeholders are usually other water users with often conflicting interests, but also the public when we deal with our consultation phase. So we make sure that background information is available at any time to everyone. We like to say that we involve the public from conceptualization of our plans to their implementation. And the difficult part is that there's no blueprint for stakeholder engagement and the public participation process. So we have, of course, the prescriptive aspects of the directives, but still it's sort of like up to your basin, how you carry out these activities. And what we've noticed is that you have to be as adaptable as possible with, for instance, the selection of the topics, the translation in national languages of reports and brochures or questionnaires to get the broadest involvement possible, and also to fill the knowledge gap. That's what we do when we feel after a consultation period that there is a knowledge gap in a certain area, so we try to fill that void. So who is a stakeholder? A stakeholder is an individual, organization, institution who will have an interest in an issue because this individual organization is either affected or may have some influence. To avoid disappointing the parties, we find it very important to make clear what the role of those involved is and what they can do. Public participation is really the most important way of working with the public, whether like-minded or not, that's important, and also a very fast-changing process. And we've got to, as I said, we've got to follow the pace of the evolution. So what we do at the ICPDR to approach this mandatory activity is we have created the ICPDR Public Participation Toolbox. We start with our commitment to a cleaner, healthier, and safer Danube River basin for present and future generations. So cleaner, we focus on reducing pollution, improving water quality, and preserving the river's beauty. Healthier, protecting diversity, restoring habitats, and promoting sustainable practices for aquatic life. And safer, implementing measures for effective flood protection and enhancing disaster resilience. So this cleaner, healthier message is a very easy, safer is a very easy message to memorize. It reaches a wide audience. It shows that by embracing these 3 pillars, we're dedicating to preserving the basin for future generations. At the end of the day, in the center, we have the water resources and human well-being of those 79 million people who call the Danube River Basin their home. We also have our 24 observer organizations who play a crucial role in our public participation effort. There is a connective tissue that really brings the observers and the ICPDR together, and the connective tissue is that work that we do with our observers. These observers represent social, cultural, economic interests and environmental interests, of course, and the academia. A community responsibility, together with our stakeholders, we really thrive to achieve these long-lasting objectives. We also feel that early and continuous involvement is very important. We have educational tools like the platform danubebox.org. We have an online game, danubeadventure.org, and we have where we have valuable resources for teachers, and we have Danube Day. And Danube Art Master. Danube Art Master is an environmental competition that is a derivative product of Danube Day, which is this festival that happens every year on June 29th and celebrates the Danube. We have branding campaigns, we have our 3 pillars, and of course we have social media and stakeholder consultation. So these are 24 stakeholders, and I'd just like to finish 2 more slides. Engaging the public with our flagship events. So as I said, we have Danube Day, we have Danube Art Master. This is our way to engage, to raise awareness, to encourage active participation and knowledge sharing, and to inspire individuals and communities to take action for a sustainable future. And maybe a surprising slide to talk about giveaways, but it's actually goodies are a very good way of leveraging outreach and engaging your stakeholders. I present my giveaways at events, and then someone says, I'd like to have your mug. I'll say, okay, you want my mug? You've got to listen to my story. And that really works, and that creates a memorable experience, and that reinforces the message and helps us to establish a connection with the audience and leaving a lasting impression. The newsroom communication is key, of course, because it's you need to communicate with your public. You need to be everywhere. The public participation process is a very complex process. You deal with different audiences, following different channels. You need to be very flexible, and you also need to communicate with the press. That's also non-negligible. Working with journalists is very important to make sure what they write about us is accurate and fact-based. Why public participation works, I promise it's my last slide. The public participation process requires investment of time, energy, and resources. And I am a strong believer in in public participation, I've seen that investing in a well-managed public participation process pays off in the end. So yes, it's a tool to achieve environmental objectives by the Water Framework Directive, but it is not an end in itself. And trust, transparency, and good management of expectations are really essential for public participation. And I thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Hélène. I love how the ICPDR does the stakeholder engagement, and I'll also admit that I'm a big fan of the goodies. I do have the coloring book with the Danube fish in my office, and I can very much recommend it for stressful moments to take 5 minutes and color some Danube fish. But that aside, let's move to another very important, sometimes considered as boring, but I think extremely crucial topic when it comes to basin management is where do we find the money to do all these nice things? And I think there are lots of interesting examples around the world to funding and financing basin cooperation, and I think the Mekong is a particularly interesting one. So I'm happy that we have Santi Baran with us today from the MRC. Santi, please share the MRC story when it comes to money.
Thank you, Susanna. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Santi Baran. I'm the Chief Strategy and Partnership Officer from the Mekong River Commission. I also have my CEO here, very handsome gentleman with the blue tie. He's Dr. Anulak. So now I've introduced you to him, so he will take all the tough questions. So in terms of sustainable financing, so in the evolution of MRC, like every organizational, it goes through a life cycle. So this is just one snapshot of the evolution that MRC has gone through. So we have a roadmap that in 2030, right here, in 2030, we want to be fully self-financed just by the member countries, no development partner funding. But in order to get there, it wasn't an easy roadmap. You know, we have to face a lot of challenges and turbulence. So I just want to highlight two key events that took place for your attention. I think in the year of 2000 and 2015, we have 12 different programs, and this was the pinnacle of reaching of the MRC, not in terms of achievement, but in terms of the highest number of staff and the highest funding. We have 200 plus staff with over $120 million funding for 5 years. So, but it comes with a cost, you know, having that high funding, 12 programs with 200 plus staff. Each program tend to be very silo. You know, it was not very well integrated. It was not well aligned. Each program has their own log frame. Each have their own steering committee. Each have their own implementation plans. And, you know, there were too many programs that we were in the business of organizing meetings. We were so good at organizing meetings that in 1 month, we went to 12 to 15 meetings in just 1 month. And another thing is that we have two strategies. We have the MRC organizational strategies, and we have the basin development strategies. And the two were not very well succinct. You know, they were quite divorced from each other. And what the MRC was doing, it did not contribute to the achievement and impact of the basin level. And we took that lesson, and then in 2006, 2010, we tried to integrate those two together. So we took the one result chain approach where the outcome of the MRC is now attributed to the impact of the basin level. So now it's a one basin development strategy approach. The second key event that I would like to highlight is we've introduced basket funding. So the concept of basket funding is that, so once you have a clear collective strategy that are focused on the basin priorities, the basket funding is a pool funding where development partners are supporting those funds, and the member countries' needs are defined in the implementation of those funds. So they're not based on, you know, donors or development partner needs of each of the funding. So it's a basket funding concept. Let's take a look at the situation right now. So if you look at the green line. So we went from 200, which is the pinnacle of staffing of 200 staff, and then in 2016 we dropped to 60 staff, And we aim to be roughly around 40 to 50 staff. So in order to be self-financed, and we have to sustain the operational costs of the organization, we decided this is the optimum amount of staffing for the Secretariat. If you look at the red line, which is the funding of our development partners, it reached really high, which is the highest, and it went down, and it's currently going down towards zero in 2030. In 2020, by 2025, you will have only 38% of development partners funding. And if you look at the blue, which is the member country contribution, it's slowly, incremental until it reaches, 62% of the total contribution. So if you look at the proportion of the funding right now, so we have 38% development partners funding, slowly, gradually go down, and you have 62% member countries funding. And it wasn't easy negotiation on the contribution from member countries. We first attempted using criteria base, and this is where it didn't work. Basically, we look in terms of what is the average flow from each country, what is the population of each country, what was the GDP of each country, what was the fishery amount in each country, what was the water use, what was the investment. So we look at different criteria, but it led to more debate. It didn't work. So we decided to use an equal contribution where, all the countries contribute equally, and it has a roadmap of how we're going to get there to 100%. And I think this was one of the lessons learned. To take away, important lesson learned, for you to take away, I think I have 5 takeaway points. I think the first one is really member countries' ownership. And I think in order to create good ownership from the member countries is, as an RBO, you need to harness your competitive advantage. What competitive advantage you want to focus on as an RBO. You cannot be a jack of all trades doing many things in all different sectors. You have to prioritize and you have to be good at it. And this is where your competitive advantage as an RBO is. And then the members countries will see have ownership and see the value of your river basin organization. The second one is the M&E system. Having a basket fund is not easy. You need to have a good M&E system for finance. So we passed all the EU pillar assessment. Thanks God, we did. We put in place audit charter. We put in place audit committee. We put in place internal audit. All the auditing that you can imagine, it's all operationalized in MRC right now. So that created a lot of transparency, a lot of internal controls that we put in place at the organizational M&E. So that is one of the most important things. The fourth one is really look in terms of the basin development strategy. You have to take into account member country position and interests, and this is very important. You have to collectively align them to a joint success, and having a basin development is very important if you want to have a sustainable financing. Lastly, relationship development. We recently, CNO and I, we had a chance to engage the Rio Grande Commission, and there's a saying in Mexico that tequila makes friends and water makes enemy. So the moral of the story is not to drink tequila, but the moral of the story is that we have to build relationship if you're in the water management business. And in MRC, we also prioritize that, not the drinking part, but the building the relationship. So we've put very much priority in building the relationship of 6 countries, which includes Myanmar and China, into our relationship development. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Santi. The Mekong, I think, is definitely an interesting example when it comes to reform, financial reform, but also management reform. A lot of basin organizations have tried. We've seen reforms in the Niger Basin, the Lake Chad Basin, but I think if you want to see a successful, yet lots of interesting lessons to learn example, the Mekong is one to look at. Well, that was the input part, so to say, of today's session. We're now moving to a panel discussion for which I'm going to invite a few people here on stage. But also, if you already have questions, you can already signal that to me and we'll take them. But let me introduce the panelists first. I would like to welcome back on stage Tatelenka and Helene. And then we're adding to this group Malte Grossmann, who is the head of the Nile Basin Initiative Program of GIZ, the German Development Cooperation Agency. Malte, if you can also come here. Astrid Hilles from JEF International Waters. and Anulak Kittikun, who was just introduced already by Santi, the CEO of the Mekong River Commission. If you just all join me here, please. Anulak, if you can bring the microphone, yes, and if you can bring the microphone there, great. Good, yeah, small stage, but it's all the basins united. Someone should take a nice picture. Thanks, Claudette. Yes, you have a microphone. I would actually like to start with one of the issues that Santi just mentioned on an RBO really identifying its unique value, its added benefit. And I would like to start maybe with you, Anulak. To put you on the spot here. If you can elaborate a little bit more what the benefits of cooperation really are in the Mekong. So why are we doing all of this, going through all these hurdles, developing basin management plans, bringing all these stakeholders in, finding money? What's in it for everyone?
Yeah, thank you, Susanna. I was not expecting to go first. But I think as Santi pointed out earlier, I think the basin development strategy process really brought the countries of the Mekong together. But I think a greater challenge for us right now is our cooperation with upstream China, and where they call the Mekong the Lansang. And by the way, the Chinese gave a motto to the Lansang Mekong Cooperation, which is shared river, shared future, which is the same as the shared basin, shared destiny. So it's not so bad after all what the Chinese gave us. But the challenge is that, the Mekong Lansang has never been managed in an integrated fashion. We have some data sharing before for the past 20 years, and that has worked pretty well. And then through negotiations and effort, now we get more data sharing, from flood season to whole year round. But to really get to an integrated basin management, because they built a number of dams upstream. And so far, we have only been able to sort of understand how that works, but we have bore the brunt of the impact. To get to a more comprehensive basin sharing, we have started a joint study. And at the end of this joint study, which is this year, we are, I think, actively moving towards a joint understanding of how the basin works, both upper and lower. And then to have a practical recommendations in terms of notification regime, on how dams are operating, and then move towards coordination. Not just for the production, say, of energy, but also, when drought hits or when flood hits, what do those dams, should do? So we're moving, I think, towards an integrated management of the basin, but it's a very great challenge ahead.
Thanks, Anulak. Maybe you can hand the microphone to Ntate Lenka, because I'd be curious, from the orange, can you give us some specific examples how the countries, the people, the basin has benefited from the fact that Orascom is managing the basin?
Oh, thank you very much. I think what's important to us is the emphasis on joint actions. In that, in the past, we have had several projects which at best were bilateral, but yes, and many others which the countries were doing individually. But through the river basin planning and delivery of actions, we are seeing more and more joint actions, some very big projects which we are trying to address. The other element is that at the river basin scale, we are more able to address some basin-wide or basin scale issues related to water scarcity, and something that I know we don't speak about it very loudly, but is always there at the back of our discussions, is the issue of water allocation. The river basin in the Orange Synchro is highly, I said stretched earlier today, let me continue with that word, in that we have many dams built, we have very large scale water transfers and abstractions, and there is a possibility for addressing trade-offs only when you are at the river basin scale discourse or dialogues. And that's where water allocation issues are most meaningfully addressed. These are the two key benefits that I just wanted to share from our side. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Lenka. I see the questions coming in. I'll use the opportunity to ask one more myself before we get to the audience, because I'm curious. Malte, you've been observing cooperation in basins in the Nile, but also elsewhere for a long time. Do you think that benefits like the ones mentioned or others that you see in the Nile or elsewhere, are they really increasing countries' commitment to actually cooperate?
Thank you. Yes, as Gia said, we've been working with many RBOs over the years, and we all know that basin cooperation is really not a linear process. And from the Nile, we have this vision or this picture of getting into virtual cycles of commitment. Huh? So, you know, having the vision, you're moving to capacity development, joint understanding of the issues, but then delivering benefits, that are visible and tangible, that then go back into the visibility and motivation, and that build the political will and commitment to again drive the cycle into deepening cooperation or higher levels of aspiration. And I think that also in the Nile Basin, or what I'm seeing also in these discussions, we also have to look at how the levels interact. In the Nile Basin, we often look at the question, are the big issues being addressed? But we also see that there's a lot of cooperation in cross-border settings that is actually developing, let me say, the culture of cooperation and the way to go about things that then goes back into promoting what happens at the basin-wide level and pushes that that virtuous circle forward. So the other question that comes to my mind then when you go in this circle, there's also this issue of expectations and the fallacy of maybe too high expectations. I was seeing it also with the MRC, way big expectations, what the RBOs now can deliver. And I think then when we talk about the expectations again, or the commitment, you're asking about the commitment. There's two things, a commitment to the basin vision, the basin agenda, and the commitment, let me say, to the mechanism, to the RBO. These are related, but they're not the same. And I think the Nile Basins had a similar experience to the MRC in terms of, having first strong institutional plans, strategies, that were then not fully the same as, let me say, the basin development plan. And I think Nile Basin, what we've seen has been a similar process to what you presented from MRC, to as the institutions mature to really look at focus on the basin vision, on what can be done in terms of the different levels participating, the countries and the regional levels. So these virtual cycles, that is what needs to be driven, and that is also what needs the long, let me say, the long breath, and that is what we hope to be, or what we have been doing with our partners for many years.
Thanks, Malte. There is a gentleman waiting patiently in the back already, Zoe, who is a PhD student at OSU and IHE Delft, is bringing you the microphone. You had your hand up. No, yes? Would you kindly just introduce your name and your affiliation?
I am not a PhD student. That's all you need to know. No. So my name is Franz Matzner, and I'm here representing the International Campaign for Tibet. And I have what is likely going to be a bit of a pointed, controversial question, and I hope that it causes some conversation. So the first is, when we look at the Mekong River Commission, I'd like to ask, so I have basically a three-part question, is one, the headwaters are flowing from the glaciers in Tibet, and so I am interested to hear how the Tibetan, plateau and its sourcing, not just for the Mekong, but for many of the riparian issue, sources all through the region is being taken into account. And my follow-up question on that is, related in that, we're talking about individual basins, and that's one step, but in the context of changing climate, it's all interdependent. So how do we account for, and this is for everybody, but I am focused on the Mekong, how does that interrelatedness get taken into account for these kinds of basin management plans where we need to look at it from a broader sustainability? And then third part, because one of the main themes that I've been encountering here at this Water Week is the role of indigenous people. How are the Tibetan people being involved in the planning for what is part of the, their sourcing of their water and culture and identity, especially when, as we just saw from the several special rapporteurs, that many Tibetans who stand up and ask questions about the environment are treated very harshly, including disappeared or thrown in jail. So I'd like to get some of the perspective on how that can be included in these basin conversations.
Thanks a lot. We give you a second, Anulak, to think, because I've seen there's another question here in the front. So we collect, and then maybe one more so that we can take them in bundles. Please. It should go by itself. You just start.
Okay. Good evening. My name is Matteo Dall'Amico. I'm in the private sector. I run a startup in Italy dealing with river basin modeling. And I have an experience in doing some work for the Po River Basin in Italy, which is contended, let's say, just by two nations, Italy and Switzerland, but many regions in Italy. I found that sometimes it's very difficult to get data because these data are shared among regional institutions or national institutions, and homogenizing the data is really sometimes a big effort. So I'm just wondering, in such bigger river basins, how the data management or the modeling management is done, if you have agreed on a one model, on a one database, to share database, open access, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there one more question? Yes, in the very back, and then.
Hi, thanks. You actually took my question because I was going to ask about monitoring, but I have another one, which is, we've heard about the sort of, in the MRCs that all of a sudden that the countries are going to take over the funding of it. And I'm just curious for your experiences, like what were the aha moments from the governments and the countries that are part of these basins that really made them think, okay, actually this is something that we're wanting to support, that we want to take ownership of, and that we want to sort of support long term? Because I know that can sometimes be a challenge when you're trying to bring government partners in on the journey. So I just would like to hear your experiences with that.
Thank you. So let's take these questions. I'm wondering, Anulak, can you maybe take the first and the third? And I'm wondering if maybe Hélène or Astrid want to talk about the data afterwards, given that you have very global and great basin experience. But Anulak, I don't know, Malte has the microphone.
Yeah, I'm not sure if the first is targeted to me only, but anybody from China in here? This will dictate my answer. No, the headwaters of the Mekong, but also for several other major rivers in the world are from Tibet. So obviously, the Tibetan plateau are very important in terms of the source. For the Mekong, the contribution from China to the Mekong is depend on the season. So at the dry season, it's greater than the wet season. But there are other sources, from the local basin itself. So when we do an assessment of the water availability and to feed into this basin management, we take into account different sources. But I think we are coming to a more common understanding with the Chinese in terms of the availability from China, and also what is needed to manage that source. Because for a very long time, as I said, there has never been an integrated management between the two parts, upper and lower. But I think at the end of this joint study, there are concessions made on both sides in terms of the understanding. And tied to the modeling question, we have had never also a common modeling platform. We have our models, they have their model. But in this study, we are comparing the two models, and they're not so bad in terms of the results. but it would be greater to have a common modeling. And as for the interest of the different users, including, I think, the ethnic indigenous people in the headwater, I think I'm hopeful that there will be a process to include them into the decision making, eventually, the whole basin management. As they always say, shared river, shared future, right? So I think everybody has to be included in that. And for the third question, I think there's no aha moment. We work very hard with the member countries and with development partners to put in place a very, how can I say, roadmap to go towards this 2030. But I guess if you want to have an aha moment, it could be the one that Santi mentioned in terms of that plateau, in 2014-15, where it was out of control. The money that was coming in, and there was no way to sustain that. And then there was a realization that, okay, if that money disappear or donors had other interests, where does the basin management come from? So then the leaders said that, okay, let's do something about this. And the Mekong, very interesting, and I think we're very proud of this as well, since the annual contribution from the member countries have been agreed in this formula. We have never had missing payments. So even in COVID crisis, countries, even poor countries in the basin, they still pay. I still get a check of $1.5 million, even in a crisis. So the commitment is there. They see the value that we are providing. But in terms of the impact, of course, that's another discussion. Thank you.
Thanks. Helen, do you want to maybe share something about the Danube data sharing, which is quite elaborate given how many countries you have?
That's correct. I'd like to say two things. The way we started at the ICPDI is actually by sharing data. So even before they created this magnificent public participation expert group, the ICPDI was sharing data through what you call the TNMN, the Transnational Monitoring Network. So data is really the basis of the cooperation that we have between our countries. That's very important. The sharing of the data and the openness about that. And beyond data, I'd like to say that what's also very important, at least in the Danube River Basin, is the expert group system that we have, and the fact that it's really a bottom-up approach instead of a top-down approach, where experts meet, they are practitioners, they are technical people, they share their knowledge, and then they pass that on to the policymakers. So that is also a definitely. They share data as well, of course. Very heavily data-related work that we do at the ICPD. Obviously, Susanne has invited the least technical person that works at the Secretariat, but I can still tell you this much. It really works, and openness and transparency of data is truly important.
Thanks. I'm wondering, Astrid, Jeff supports data sharing, transboundary diagnostic assessments, and so on around the world. Can you elaborate a bit on it? And if I may add a little question to that, is that all getting easier or more difficult with climate change?
Easy questions. So I think we could talk a long time about data and information sharing and river basin management. So you were just asking about uniform data, but it's one of these early things that need to happen. And when we see it, the GF experience, it also built the trust and put every country on the same basin and information. So you start with very different perceptions between the countries, what the flows from one country to the other are, and what the impacts from one country to the other are. So these processes on the transboundary diagnostic analysis, it's a lot of times also, coming from your national assessments to a common basin one thing. And then it follows that you need to start exchanging data so you can have one view in one system and one model of the system. Which, of course, as many of you know, is not an easy feat sometimes. Sharing data a lot of times starts on a time sharing, flood events. Becomes easier. It's a short time, it's a limited time, and it has obvious benefits. And so you build the trust up from that we say, okay, we are sharing data across sectors and in a wider sense. And yes, once data sharing protocols are being facilitated by the RBOs, whatever the data are, there's of course when to get the data, how to get the data, what format to get the data, and what database to feed it into, so they would be harmonized. Has it been easy? You could all talk about it when you started your RBOs? No, because it sits in different sectors and sits in different formats, and a lot of times it doesn't sit in a database, it sits in a white paper report. So, but it is a very important process, not for the data and the data sakes and to get the models going, but to look at the world, at the river basin system in one view, and can it ask questions? What are the real facts of impacts from up and downstream and from changing a regulation of one infrastructure? What happens on the other infrastructure, or what happens to the city downstream or the wetland downstream or so forth? So that is a process that in some shape or other gets funded through most river basin organizations, be it GF or other. And databases being built on the basin scale, and maybe models then also be pushed out to the country so they can use it and talk to their minister with the same model so that it's credible and so forth. And you had another... Climate. And climate is, of course, that's where the RBOs can really have a benefit, because you look at the whole system as an integrated, right? You're looking at an integrated water resources and nature management system, hopefully, not all of it. It gets much harder, right? Because we have now faster onsets of floods, much more extremes. You thought climate change was a small onset thing. Now look, it's not. We're seeing much more extremes, much faster than we thought. Look at the Danube and the Rhine and so forth. I come from Germany. It used to be really wet there. Now, out of a sudden, you have to deal with drought. And out of a sudden, from countries that used to deal with the floods in their countries and having to cooperate on that made sense. And out of a sudden, it's drought, and you might have to use and move forward to water allocation. Then, looking at climate change, your pressures on your system become higher. So you need to be more innovative. You need to get more sectors faster to the table. Lenka, you talked about how hard it is to get all these different sectors on board. With climate change, the pressures get much harder. You cannot lose so much water in the system. You have to do innovative technology, be more efficient, and move on. And also maybe change growth patterns and so forth. Not an easy conversation, hard to do. And then the other thing comes, the other resource that get taps into is groundwater, right? But the groundwater data, if on national scale, not only the data and information, the government and the management is very varying and not very clear in many countries. And it starts with the governance, right? A lot of times groundwater rights are tied to the land rights. So you have a piece of land, you put water, put your well, and you pump. Don't forget, many river basins and low flow times have a large contribution downstream from their groundwater. So does it become easier? No. And pollution will set another thing on top.
Thanks, Astrid. Do we have other questions from the room? Yes, here, please. The microphone is coming. Please don't forget to introduce yourself.
Thank you. My name is Verdian Niramana. I'm the regional chairperson of Nile Basin Discourse. It's a civil society organization, actually like yours, working closely with the Nile Basin Initiative. So I heard when you were presenting your presentation, what is the challenge about engaging the communities, maybe in terms of resources, in terms of the way community understand, and also how the government, as a civil society, you collaborate, or with the Danube Basin. Thank you.
Thanks. Helen, you want to?
Thank you. I'm happy to answer this question. Civil society is instrumental in our dialogue with stakeholders. I mean, we cannot, again, as a small commission, but still representing 14 countries in the European Union, address the concerns, the water-related concerns of 89 million people. We need help for that. So Santi was, he's not here anymore. He was making, he was making a comment about tequila. I'll have another quote, which is, if you want to walk fast, walk alone. If you want to walk far, walk together. So that's what we do in the Danube. We want to walk far, and we walk with our stakeholders. And with the civil society, their involvement is very important. And learn to listen. That's what I would say. Another important thing to do is to listen. We talk to like-minded people all the time who have the same concerns, but what about the general public who might not know about the issues at stake, who might not understand? I mean, of course, climate change is a very good way of catching the attention of the public. That's good, but that's not the only water-related issue. There are other problems that we have to deal with. So we need to make sure that the dialogue that exists is kept ongoing. We need to constantly inform, constantly engage, and constantly consult. That's what the directives are telling us. But this dialogue needs to really go both ways. I mean, to be listening to the other side. Listening is really something tremendously important. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks. I think that's actually an interesting point, because in the end it's just this increasing complexity, climate change just being one element, but we have the different sectors that we somehow need to bring together, and not every sector might be so keen on actually having water lead the way and having decisions being based on water considerations, or maybe even biodiversity and environment playing a role in wanting a share of the water. Then we also need to bring together the different, well, what we call the civil society, which is not the civil society, but actually many different groups with many, many different interests. Then we have to bring together the countries and all that under climate change. So a follow-up question for you, Helene, but also for all of the others of you. Is there like a formula that you found in your basin how to do that? The secret formula that you want to share now?
I'm looking at my notes and nothing's written there. I would say the formula is information, interpret the information for the public. I often tell my fellow experts at the Secretariat, please, what you're saying is extremely complex and people want to understand what you're talking about. And then they say, yeah, but you know, they're not interested. And I said, no, you don't know that. Actually, they are interested in everything. You have no idea how much buy-in you get from the public if you know how to present your messages. And I know that some people hate social media, and I would understand that, but I can tell you that it's been instrumental in our engagement work with the public, because we make sure that we deliver easy, bite-sized content that everyone can understand. And also, we don't, this is also very important, we don't diminish the science. We don't take out the science at all. We actually make it more prominent, but understandable. I always say, you know, technical people also like to read easy text and not convoluted sentences that they cannot make a sense of. So this is, I guess, one of the sort of the solutions. Yeah.
Thanks. Other secret formulas? I'm thinking Tatelenka, the orange is always considered a very successful example. What's your secret?
On this one?
On bringing together the different interest sectors, people?
Yeah, stakeholders. That's what I was saying. Because I don't know, you know, I can speak here like I'm alone in the room, but my brother here is from the same river basin, just the other corner of it. No, I think what Me from the Danube is saying is very important. But maybe in our case also even the language is another factor. Because we tend to think our local languages cannot speak what we are saying, because we are saying it in so many English words, but some of the local languages actually could be better in interpreting some of the things we are speaking about. But nothing secret really from the orange on this one. Maybe that brain is still to be born. No secrets on this one.
Anu, like that triggered an idea with you.
I think in the Mekong, and this is, we go back and forth all the time, I think what makes a difference for us is you have a formal mechanism with different processes and things, because you need legitimacy to move things forward. But you build things on relationship, because at the end of the day, it's about people. Right? But those two are not enough sometimes. Sometimes the formal process gets stuck, the relationship gets obstructed as well, and then you need to think strategically, you know, how to navigate between these. So I think formal process to give legitimacy, build relationship, but if those two doesn't work, then you have to think outside the box.
Astrid, do you want to add?
Quick one that goes in the same direction, though, also from Helen and others, is really the language, and you see it here, also in the meetings. there's the biodiversity and the global biodiversity framework talking about river restoration. Bring that to your energy producers. It doesn't really ring a bell, right? And the other way around. So the science policy interface, the way scientists communicate with policymakers and the way they can listen, or to the public, is a very big issue. So we have heard numbers before, and we have lost about 80-something% of freshwater biodiversity from 1970 to now. How in the world can we accept that? Any of the river basins. So we hear the numbers, we see it on the graph, but nobody has translated into what it means for people, right? So the freshwater people talk about water security for the resilient farmer. So how can have a resilient farming if you lose so much nature and biodiversity? It's not only freshwater, if you don't have pollinators, and if you don't have upstream watersheds that are intact, you will not have water security for the farmer. So I think this whole language across sectors is something that we have not figured out. To put it in terms that the other one can understand, and if it's in money terms or in terms of what it means for food production or in energy production, that we can talk around pollution, biodiversity, and climate change in a way that is not highly scientific, convoluted, and with a whole bunch of modeling behind it.
Good point. Definitely interesting and should be explored more. But are there other questions in the room, or your secret formula for collaborating in basins? Yes, go ahead. Zoe, there's a question there.
Hi everybody, my name is Sheril Wattar, I'm from Egypt, and I am actually a graduate from IHE Delft, and Dr. Susan was my professor, so I'm very happy to see her here. And during our study, we actually covered all of your basins. They were case studies that we analyzed in depth, and it was very interesting because, at least for me, being Egyptian, we have the Nile Basin. We all know the drama, but it's kind of getting better, thankfully. My question was inspired by your answers about climate change and how things will be different in the coming years. Countries that were used to, or basins that were used to abundance of water will have to deal with drought, etc. So I was curious, in terms of the basin management work that you do, and being responsible for this for years, for long years, how do you see the management approach changing in the coming years with this changing trend in climate? I guess I'm very curious in what extent do you believe your approach will need to be pragmatic, and to what extent will we need to, do you believe that you will need to change what was done or the studies that this success has been based on, since the situation itself will be different? So I'd like to hear from you, what are your thoughts about that in terms of forecasting and management for what's to come? Thank you.
Thanks, Shireen. Other questions, just to check? It's a little bit, oh yeah. So the other side of the room, sorry, I'll give you a moment to think. Who wants to go?
Hi everyone, my name is Lisa and I work with Global Water Partnership and Transboundary Water Cooperation. And I was just in another session and we had a gentleman from the World Bank saying that RBOs are really the new generation of regional organizations, and there is a great potential of RBOs to support national institutions for resolving disputes, to advise them and to equip them with all of the tools. So what do you think, what are the top kind of skills or tools that RBOs can give to national institutions to support them resolving these differences?
That's a great question indeed, a challenging one. I am not seeing urgent hands. I would therefore ask the panel, I don't know who wants to go first for the climate change. I mean, the question came from the Nile. Malta, I don't know if you want to give it a go, but you'll all.
Yeah, thank you. That also, my answer will also relate to your question. So what is the key tool of an RBO is I mean, it depends on the mandate. Yeah, I mean, we're touching on the issue of basin development, water allocation, and so on. So in the Nile Basin, there's no institution that has that way strong mandate. So the tool of the RBO is to have that conversation about the future. Yeah, so what are the plans of all the countries? What are the water resources that are available? how might they change with climate? And that is really also the main tool of the RBO, to be the custodian, let me say, of that common understanding and outlook, and to provide that platform for conversation about what might happen and what might need to be done. And so there are different things that need to be done, but I also think the work we've been supporting with the basin management plan that Dr. Michael was presenting, the idea is also to say, even if you don't maybe have an agreement, or you are not, you're not in consensus on every point, that there are many things that need to be done to adapt to the future, and that need to be done as quick as possible. And so it's important to spell out these things. So when you know that water issues will not be resolving themselves in the future automatically, you need to take proactive action, and you can identify those areas that need priority investments or a priority action to get the basins on track towards water, energy, food secure trajectory. And I think then it's all about the narrative, about making these things well understood by everybody. And if it is maybe not in a top-down, let me say, if there's no there's no framework like in the European Union that binds you to do things. It needs everybody's common understanding of where the journey goes, and to factor that into your action. So I think that's the role of these kind of platforms, to develop that vision of where things might be going, aligning the understanding, and promoting action to be taken as quick as possible to get the basins onto these trajectories.
Thanks, Malte. Who wants to add?
Yeah, I could say something, but it's a very complicated question from the Nile, because the orange Sinku, we are more or less facing the same issues about the amount of water you can sustainably keep extracting from the system moving forward. So much that I think the next 50 years or something like this, we will have to be looking elsewhere. But we'll start first with conjunctive use, making sure that you're also bringing in groundwater solutions to this, and then moving on to alternative sources such as reuse of water. But at the end of the day, we probably have to be looking at cooperation beyond single river basins, because some river basins on the continent in Africa are better endowed than others. But countries have to cooperate beyond the geographic spaces that we are speaking about for that to be possible. So yes, I think the future means more cooperation. Thank you.
Thanks. Anyone wants to add a last thought? Anurag?
Just quickly, I think on the climate change we are facing as well in the Mekong. But maybe one quick answer is storage. I think you need more storage, both man-made and natural, because then you can adapt to climate change. As for the last question on water diplomacy, Susanna wrote a good book. It's called River Basin Organization in Water Diplomacy. So the answer is there in terms of how to manage difference. But it comes down to four things. You need a good legal regime, to govern the basin, and infer some legitimacy to an institution that is quite strong in terms of its technical capability, and also the people and its sort of the vision for that basin. And you need some sort of platform, I think, where the countries come together and try to talk out their differences. So yeah.
I just like to say something a bit sort of off topic, but still related to climate change. I think that the problem with the climate change is that it's a race against time. But in situations like this, this is where we can actually show our power of resilience, and where in this kind of pressure situations, that's where things become more fluid and quicker. So I think I have confidence that this is going to bring in innovative solutions. I mean, we at the ICPDR have now taken the issue of droughts very seriously. This was not necessarily on the agenda in a water-rich basin. We act fast, and this is sort of the only chance that we have to be more resilient and to put at least a stop to what's happening.
Thanks, Hélène. That's a good positive note, and I'll take the, oh no, I can't because then I think they interfere, but that is a positive note at which I would like to end this, and actually I've asked someone to summarize and conclude for us because I wouldn't be able to conclude this very rich discussion, but I'm very happy that we have Philip Biddlestone from SIWI, the Director for Water Resources, Water Diplomacy, Water Cooperation, everything water at SIWI with us. But first of all, a big hand to all of our panelists. Thanks a lot. And Philip, now over to you.
Thank you very much, Susanna. Again, not an easy task. Philip Biddlestone, the Director of Water Cooperation and Diplomacy Department. It's a new name, so we're getting used to it. Very hard job to do in 3 minutes, but I'll try. But I think looking at the benefits that we have, I think when we talk about the river basin organizations, it's like we have to identify the benefits of cooperation and the benefit of having RBO to get that engagement. To do this, again, it's looking at the joint analyses, joint studies, joint understandings, and the action plans of what can we as actual, what can member states do together. This is, again, it's critical. And this is a mechanism that can bring the upstream and downstream partners together. This also helps develop trust, but also highlights the credibility of the RBO. Both joint activities, open and transparent data in data sharing, and an agreed upon model assist in this cooperation. This also helps with the common RBO priorities, developing those, but it is important that those priorities must be aligned to the national priorities to really get that buy-in, that engagement in the RBO process. In order to do this, when you get to that idea of common priorities, there must be an effective coordination mechanism. Again, what was mentioned was expert groups. This has worked in the past, but it's also that engagement. It can't just be left alone to work on itself. You must have sort of structures in place to guide that process with the member states. We talked a little bit about sort of looking at the stakeholder engagement. One of the things was expectation management is critical. The need and the culture of building that culture of cooperation, that's also a challenge. But more importantly, you need to address the differences in perspective, cultural values, and you can't shy away from these, but you need to engage these. I think from ICPDR, it's again, this is about communication, reaching out there, and using different products, be it branded products, media, how you engage, and media. But it's important to continue this communication with your, to sort of reach out and work with the groups, listen to them, and say, okay, we hear you. We can actually take on what you're saying, or adapt our programs to that if necessary. On financing, we talked about basket funding. That is one way to sort of take away sort of the different perspectives and the different needs of financiers to align them more to what the needs are of the basin and the plans of the basin. But this also is important to actually have a M&E mechanism to show that there is progress on each of the needs of the financiers. The other challenge is, I think, what in the Mekong was, what is your effective size? You might just get too big, you might get too much money, and you might not be able to, you might get lost in that process. So what is the right size for an RBO to effectively deliver on the ground? I can keep going, but again, the challenges, I think, is the complexities we face, be it the interactions, the use of water, and the new drivers of change. The other one is there are several entities, several mandates that overlap each other. So how can you rectify those and sort of align them? Be it a Ramsar site, be it inside an RBO, how do you align those? The other point, which is we're working to balance development and environmental protection within an area of climate change, increasing demand, and at the same time, we are asking to do it faster in a process that is about cooperation. Cooperation takes time. It also takes a lot of money. which we usually do not have. So how do we link all that together and sort of meet this challenge? And I think this group here is a second step, I think. And hopefully we can continue this dialogue going forward from this to go forward and sort of address some of these issues of the speeding up. The change is increasing, the demand is increasing. But quick summary, 3 points or 4 points is, I think the aha moment, there was none. You actually have to sort of, you have a plan, follow that plan and say, okay, we are moving on this plan. No aha, but bringing people to the table. The other conventions, bring them to the table. Other sectors, other approaches, welcome those. Climate change and the demands on water are challenging our main tool, models and data. So it's again, how do we address this challenge to our main tool is being sort of questioned by the changes and changes in dynamic. We need to move quicker. It's not easy with engagement processes. We need to find the financing. And I think was the last point is we need to have the technical capability to address these changes within the RBO. I'll sum it up with that, but I hope we can continue with our dialogue. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Philip, and just to wish everyone a nice rest of the day and see you around. Thanks a lot. And all the speakers and panelists, come here for a picture, please.